There is a type of learning that does not arise in classrooms, nor through traditional methods, but in environments where making mistakes is costly, where information needs to be absorbed quickly, organized with precision, and retrieved under pressure, because when time is limited and the margin for error is minimal, learning slowly is simply not an option. It is in this context that intelligence agencies, strategic analysts, and high-level operators develop a completely different relationship with knowledge, not based on natural talent, but on extremely efficient mental systems. Maybe you have already felt that you learn, but too slowly, that you understand the content, but take a long time to connect the ideas, or that you study a lot and still feel that your brain doesn't keep up with the speed that life demands, and this creates a silent frustration, because it seems that there is an invisible barrier between you and that level of mental clarity that other people demonstrate so naturally. The truth is that this limit is rarely intellectual, it is structural, because almost no one learns as they should, almost no one has been taught to organize information the way the brain actually processes, consolidates, and retrieves data, especially in contexts of high cognitive demand. What you will see here is not about memorizing faster or consuming content at an absurd speed, but about learning how someone trained to think under pressure learns, reducing mental noise, increasing clarity, and doubling the speed at which new information makes sense in your head. And if this type of learning interests you, it's worth subscribing now, because from here on, the logic changes completely. Most people believe that learning quickly is a matter of above-average intelligence, privileged memory, or some rare skill with which only a few are born, when in reality what differentiates those who learn quickly from those who learn slowly is the mental model used to handle information, because the brain does not process everything in the same way and responds very differently depending on the structure you impose on the content. Since early on, we were trained to consume information passively, attending long classes, reading entire chapters without a clear objective, and accumulating data without a defined organizational criterion, which creates a false sense of learning but does not build mental speed, because understanding something once does not mean being able to access that knowledge quickly when you need it. In contexts of high cognitive performance, such as strategic intelligence or analysis under pressure, learning is not about absorbing everything, but quickly separating what matters from what is noise, creating lean mental maps that allow for quick connections and immediate retrieval of information, something that is rarely taught in traditional educational environments. The result is that many students spend years studying and still feel that their brains are slow to react, take time to connect ideas, and freeze when they need to think in real time, not due to a lack of ability, but because they have never been exposed to a method that prioritizes clarity, hierarchy, and speed of access to knowledge. Understanding this context is essential because accelerated learning does not begin with advanced techniques, but with the awareness that learning slowly is not a destination, it is merely a consequence of a wrong model that can be adjusted. The central thesis behind accelerated learning is simple, but it contradicts almost everything you have learned about studying so far. Mental speed does not come from absorbing more information, but from drastically reducing the amount of information the brain needs to process to reach a clear conclusion, because the less noise there is between the stimulus and understanding, the faster the thought flows. In operational environments, learning does not mean mastering an entire subject, but quickly identifying the few elements that support everything else, creating a minimal yet functional mental structure that allows for analysis, decision-making, and action without hesitation, something very different from the traditional academic model, which values volume and repetition but ignores cognitive efficiency. The brain works better when it recognizes patterns, hierarchies, and causal relationships, and when these structures are clear, information retrieval becomes almost instantaneous, which explains why some people seem to think faster, when in reality they have just organized their knowledge in a smarter way. Learning like an operator is not about memorizing isolated data, but about building streamlined mental maps, where each new piece of information finds a logical place immediately, avoiding overload and eliminating the need to revisit the same content countless times. Everything that follows is based on this thesis. If you learn to structure knowledge before consuming it, mental speed naturally increases, because the brain stops swimming in loose information and begins to move along already defined paths. When time is short and information needs to be used immediately, no one learns by starting with details, extensive theory, or excessive context, because that only creates cognitive delay, and that is exactly why trained operators always learn from the outside in, first understanding the big picture, then the critical points, and only then the details that really matter. This model works because the brain needs a framework before receiving information, something that indicates where each piece of data fits, and without this framework, all new content becomes dead weight, requiring extra effort to be organized later, which slows down thinking and increases mental fatigue. In practice, this means that before studying any subject, you need to answer 3 simple but strategic questions. What really underpins this topic? What decisions does this knowledge allow you to make? And in what situations is it applied? Because these answers create a mental framework that accelerates the entire learning process. When this skeleton exists, each new piece of information finds a clear place immediately, reducing the need for rereading, excessive revision, or forced memorization. And it is at this point that mental speed begins to increase noticeably, because the brain stops reorganizing chaos and simply fills in already prepared structures. Learning under pressure is not about being faster, but about being more selective, and the sooner you learn to filter what matters, the less energy you waste and the quicker the knowledge becomes usable. There comes a point where many students believe they are accelerating their learning, when in fact they are just increasing the volume of information consumed, confusing speed with haste, and this mistake comes at a high cost in the medium term, because the brain can keep up for a few days, but starts to freeze when it realizes it is accumulating data without being able to transform it into usable understanding. Learning quickly is not about piling up concepts, but about reducing the time between receiving information and being able to use it to explain, decide, or solve something concrete. And when that bridge is not formed, the brain enters a state of silent overload, where everything seems familiar, but nothing is truly available on demand. It is at this moment that the feeling of a slow mind, of blanking out during tests, of difficulty articulating ideas arises, not due to a lack of study, but because the learning was done without cognitive compression, without reducing the content to its functional core, something operators are trained to do from the beginning. They learn knowing that each piece of information needs to justify its existence within the mental system, and if it doesn't serve to make decisions or generate clear understanding, it is discarded or left for later, avoiding unnecessary accumulation that makes thinking heavy and slow. When you understand this, you realize that speeding up learning is not about running faster, but carrying less mental weight, and this change in posture not only increases the speed of thought but also reduces anxiety and cognitive fatigue over time. The real turning point happens when you realize that mental speed is not something you force, but something that emerges when the brain stops wasting energy organizing useless information, because while you try to learn everything, trained operators learn just enough to think clearly and act precisely. At this point, learning ceases to be a constant accumulation and becomes a process of compression, where each topic is reduced to its functional core, allowing the brain to recognize patterns quickly and respond without hesitation, even under pressure, something impossible when the mind is burdened with loose and irrelevant details. When you shift this focus, something curious happens. Studying stops feeling burdensome because the brain feels like it is truly making progress, not just consuming information, and this sense of cognitive control creates a positive cycle where learning generates clarity, and clarity generates more mental speed. It is at this moment that learning begins to integrate into identity, ceasing to be an external task and becoming an internal skill, something you carry with you and apply to any new subject, whether it be a school subject, a technical skill, or a completely unknown topic. From here on, it's no longer about trying to learn quickly, but about accepting that thinking quickly is a natural consequence of a streamlined mental system, and in the next step, the mistakes that hinder this transition become evident. One of the biggest obstacles to accelerating learning is the belief that understanding everything deeply from the beginning is a sign of competence, when in practice this stance only slows down the process because it forces the brain to deal with levels of complexity for which it has not yet built a structure, creating confusion instead of clarity. Another common mistake is confusing exposure with mastery, consuming videos, classes, and texts in sequence without actively testing information retrieval, which creates the misleading sensation of progress but does not strengthen the neural connections necessary to think quickly on demand. There is also the myth that constantly reviewing everything is the best way to learn, when in fact excessive reviews, without clear criteria, keep the brain stuck in cycles of repetition that do not require real effort, preventing efficient consolidation and delaying the formation of automatic responses. Moreover, many students ignore the mental cost of keeping multiple subjects open at the same time, jumping from one topic to another without closure, which fragments attention and creates a state of chronic overload that drastically reduces the speed of thought, even in intelligent and dedicated individuals. Avoiding these mistakes doesn't require more hours of study, but more intention in how you organize your learning, and if this makes sense to you, leave a like afterward, because supporting this type of content helps keep deeper discussions like this one happening. When you observe what neuroscience shows about efficient learning, it becomes clear that the brain was not made to store large volumes of disconnected information, but to recognize patterns, relationships, and hierarchies, because this is how it reduces energy cost and increases response speed, something essential in high cognitive pressure environments. Research on working memory shows that the brain can actively maintain only a few elements at a time, and when learning is not compressed, these limits are quickly exceeded, causing confusion, slowness, and the feeling of an overloaded mind, even when the person has studied for hours. On the other hand, when information is organized into clear conceptual blocks, the brain begins to treat entire sets of data as a single functional unit, a process known as chunking, which frees up mental space and allows for faster reasoning, more precise decision-making, and almost immediate retrieval of knowledge when needed. It is exactly this mechanism that trained professionals use, even if intuitively, when reducing complex subjects to a few operational principles, because once these principles are clear, the details fit together naturally when needed, without the need to carry them all the time in conscious memory. When learning respects this logic, the brain enters a state of increasing efficiency, where each new topic is absorbed faster than the previous one, not because you suddenly became smarter, but because you started learning in a way compatible with the neural architecture that supports fast thinking. In practice, learning like an operator means abandoning chaotic study and adopting a mental operating system, simple enough to be repeated on any subject, but rigid enough to prevent dispersion, because cognitive speed does not arise from total freedom, but from well-defined boundaries. The first step of this system is always to start with the map, never the detail, identifying in a few minutes what the 3 or 4 concepts that underpin the entire topic are, even if this initial understanding is imperfect, because the brain prefers an incomplete map to no structure at all, and it is this skeleton that will guide all subsequent learning. Next, you turn each central concept into an operational question, something that needs to be answered clearly, like, in what situation is this used, or what problem does this solve, because questions force the brain to organize information actively, speeding up consolidation and avoiding passive content consumption. The third element is immediate testing, where you try to explain what you learned in your own words, even if in a simple way, because this retrieval effort forces the brain to close gaps and quickly reveals what is still unclear, saving hours of unproductive study. When this system is applied consistently, learning stops being slow and burdensome, because you are no longer trying to memorize everything, but rather building reusable structures that make any new topic easier to absorb than the previous one. In the end, learning like an operator does not mean adopting a persona or romanticizing high-pressure environments, but understanding that the human mind responds better when information is organized with intention, hierarchy, and purpose, because mental speed arises when the brain knows exactly where everything is and when to use it. What separates those who learn quickly from those who always feel behind is not hidden talent, but the ability to reduce complexity without losing functionality, creating internal structures that allow for clear thinking even in the face of new, difficult, or seemingly chaotic topics. When you start learning this way, something changes silently. Studying stops being a constant accumulation and becomes a process of refinement, where each new piece of knowledge makes the next one easier, faster, and less tiring, creating a sense of cognitive control that many people have never experienced. Over time, this way of learning transforms into identity, not because you put in more effort, but because the brain recognizes that this model works, reduces friction, and delivers real results, making quick thinking no longer an exception but the norm. If you want to continue developing this type of mental clarity, subscribe to the channel and consider supporting the project, because learning well is not just about studying more, it's about building a mind that keeps up with the speed of life.